Grüezi Amerika, Views from the Sister Republic, a University of St. Gallen podcast by Claudia Brüwiler. Grüezi miteinander, and welcome back to another episode with Views from the Sister Republic. It's been a wild ride so far during the Trump administration, so I think we're all in need of some escapism, or at least let's hope it's a bit escapist, and that is the silver screen or the factory of dreams, Hollywood. But is Hollywood really a place to escape to nowadays, or has it become just as politicized and controversial in these days of polarization and political division? Who better to talk to about this than my colleague, Suzanne Enzerink. Hello, Susanna.
Hi, Claudia. Thank you for having me.
You've been in St. Gallen now for 3 years, if I'm not mistaken, and you joined us from a rather, I don't want to say exotic place, but not really the usual route people take on their career journey. Because before joining the University of St. Gallen as an assistant professor, you were an assistant professor at American University of Beirut in Lebanon. And before that, you did your PhD at Brown University in beautiful Providence, Rhode Island. But you got your first degree work done in your native country, the Netherlands, in Groningen, which doesn't have better weather than St. Gallen, I would say. Is that fair?
That is absolutely fair. I was very prepared for the weather here when I moved.
Not in comparison to Lebanon, but in comparison to Groningen, St. Gallen weather can hold up. But
yes.
You are the kind of person who has a really interesting trajectory behind them when it comes to the choice of your subject, because you studied American studies really from scratch at Groningen. But before starting your university journey, you had never been to the US, I learned. So how does one who had never been to the US decide to go into American studies of all things?
That's a very good question, and it's in a way related to what we are talking about today, because in the Netherlands, unlike in Germany and often in Switzerland, we don't dub popular culture. So virtually all the popular culture that I consumed, be it movies, television, etc., it was all in English and also predominantly American. And the same was true for the news media. I grew up watching a lot of, the 8 o'clock news, and it wasn't always in English, but usually the subjects were somehow related to the United States. So I grew up both with this somewhat romanticized notion of the United States through Hollywood, and then also this question, why is so much of the media dominated by US events, by people talking about the United States in the world, etc. And that's what really drove me to look into American studies.
And then you went to the United States for the first time during your studies, right?
Correct. Yeah. I went on exchange to the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill for a semester.
So you right to the South
Exactly.
to really dive in. Could you share one of your favorite anecdotes of living in the United States, something that you consider typically American?
Typically American. I think for me, a lot of it was a culture shock when I arrived to UNC. As you say, it's in the South, but it's also a school that's completely sports obsessed. So UNC has a very big rivalry with Duke University. I was completely unaware of this when I arrived, but you can really even do something as small as wearing a color blue that is slightly too dark, because then it looks like the Duke colors, and UNC has a more baby blue color scheme for its mascot. But then it was also something, relatively small, like having a roommate. I was in a room that was maybe 10 square meters. I shared it with a very lovely girl named Flannery. That's about as Southern as it can get, right? From Durham. And yeah, it was just really navigating the whole college experience. It was really an adventure, but also in many ways, I found it exhausting. All the new impressions, getting accustomed to not having private space, having to share a dorm bathroom with 20 other girls on the floor, and a lot of culture shock.
So it's a bit like camp going to college in the United States. When you say sports obsessed, I guess that was football, right?
Basketball in particular,
Oh.
yeah, at UNC. So they were big on basketball and football, but basketball was really the most beloved sport because they had won the championship the year before I got there. So they were, in the midst of their school pride with that.
And isn't UNC also the kind of place that had a lot of scandals related to its sports?
It did, yeah. I don't know the exact details of it, but I think the general gist of it was that they basically gave some of their basketball and football players an easier time when it came to classes. Like they weren't required to attend, or they didn't have the same final assessments as some of the other students in the class. And I think they did face some repercussions for that. But again, I'm not completely sure of the details.
Well, they're not the only university that failed meritocracy in that way. When it comes to sports, I think a lot of universities take that a lot more seriously than academics.
Yes.
But sports is one of these escapist things that Americans treasure way more than we in Switzerland, for instance, do. But there are other forms of escapism that we all love and that, as you said, lead a lot of people to get completely immersed in America. And that's Hollywood. But it's hard to escape political realities right now. I'm just saying one word, or maybe it's two: Snow White.
Yes.
I mean, talk to us a bit how a beloved fairy tale can turn into a political lightning rod.
It's a very multifaceted question, and I think I want to start with Disney itself, because Disney has really played an outsized role in these recent culture wars in the movie industry, right? So Disney has been the subject of a lot of vitriol from both the left and the right, and some of it goes back to its actions in Florida. So in 2022, Florida and Governor Ron DeSantis passed legislation that colloquially became known as the Don't Say Gay Act, which meant that in the public schooling system, you basically could not discuss anything to do with LGBTQ plus issues. It turned out that Disney had donated a lot of money to sponsor that bill, which then led to a revolt on part of Disney employees who felt, that this didn't embody the Disney values. Disney then did a complete turnaround and came out against the bill, directly challenged DeSantis, and then they faced legal repercussions in the state of Florida. So I think, stemming back to that, there was a lot of focus on Disney, and then, that combined with certain casting decisions. Snow White wasn't the first one. So Snow White stars Rachel Zegler, who has Colombian ancestry, as Snow White. A lot of people took issue with that because in the source material, Snow White is as white as snow, and they didn't think that she fit as an actress that rubric. Same thing had happened with The Little Mermaid when Halle Bailey, who's African American, was cast as the Little Mermaid. And, I think Disney just continued to face a lot of scrutiny over its casting decisions. And then, it's very hard to even unpack all the nuance for Snow White, because then within the film, you have Rachel Zegler again, who plays the lead role. And she also spoke out very much in favor of Palestinian liberation. The evil witch in the film is played by Gal Gadot, former IDF soldier, perhaps one of the most outspoken pro-Israel actors working in Hollywood today. So Disney quickly became aware that this was an impending PR disaster, and they really scaled back both the publicity and also the premiere location for Snow White. And I looked at the box office numbers this morning, and it's looking pretty dismal. I think it only made 45 million this weekend. The budget was over 250 million. So it looks like Disney will lose a lot of money on Snow White.
It's crazy. And at the same time, YouTube is full of online commentary. Like, you can hate watch a Snow White after this,
Yes.
if you're so inclined, because you mentioned that there is the racial level of criticism, that a Latina who also presents as Latina is playing Snow White. Then you have Gal Gadot as an Israeli, an outspoken former soldier playing the evil queen. And then you also have the problem of the seven dwarfs that are not dwarfs anymore, but but that's
Correct.
also not great. It's a whole lot. And it's as if Disney had been trying to please everyone and ended up pleasing no one. And it seems that this is a bit of a pattern, or am I mistaken? I'm looking back at the Oscars this year and all the controversy surrounding Emilia Perez. Or are these just outliers?
I don't think they're outliers. I think increasingly films are kind of a Rorschach test, if you will. Everyone kind of projects their own politics and their own fantasies about what the ideal nation should look like. And that's how they interpret these films. And I think it's very telling of this current polarized moment that even something as seemingly innocuous as a film can really become the subject of such a range of controversies.
At the same time, people were saying the Oscars this year were unpolitical. Did you feel that too?
I definitely think people are taking somewhat of a step back. I mean, in terms of the nominations, there was one direct nod to a more political investment of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, which was the nomination of Sebastian Stan, who starred in The Apprentice, which Trump described as a political hatchet job, and he tried to get it banned. It performed very badly at the box office in the US. It made less than $4 million, and initially US distribution companies refused to touch it, right? So you have this film, The Apprentice. It's about the rise of Donald Trump in the 70s and 80s. It premieres at the Cannes Film Festival. It receives a standing ovation and critics love it. But in the US, no one wants to touch it. And it's...
And no one wants to watch it, apparently.
And no one wants to watch it, correct. And, so the nomination... the Academy Award nomination is in a sense the only official recognition that it received. And the main actor, Sebastian Stan, even said recently that he's been blacklisted since starring in The Apprentice. There's a very popular variety series called Actors on Actors, in which famous actors are paired up and they interview each other about their craft. And he was invited to participate in that, but they could not find any other actor who wanted to pair with him because all the agents and the publicists of the other actor said, you don't want to be associated with him because he's politically suspect now after having starred in The Apprentice, and you shouldn't risk it because we don't know how the current political climate or perhaps even the current administration will change things in Hollywood. And I think that's pretty concerning.
So in a way, actors and actresses have to increasingly make politically conscious decisions as to where they star in or what vehicle that they want to support.
It seems that way, and certainly not all of them will want to do that. I think we also have all seen the headlines of actors who say, if Trump gets reelected, I'm moving out of the United States, and others who've really become politically outspoken, etc. But I think there's definitely a sense of caution that's seeping in, on part of production studios, certainly, but also on part of individual actors themselves.
So do we already see movies becoming less daring, less political? Or, given the controversies that we have about the way a fairy tale is turned into a movie, one might think that it's all political right now. But do you think that's just surface level discussions, or do we really see a move away from politically thorny issues in Hollywood?
It's probably a combination of both. On the one hand, I do think production studios are very consciously moving away from it. So Bob Iger, who is one of the chief executives at Disney after the Don't Say Gay scandal, he very explicitly said, we have to entertain first. It's not about messages. And he really wanted Disney to step away from any kind of overt political messaging. And that's been echoed in industry reports by anonymous executives. So most of them don't want to go on record, but you read a lot of, people saying, for Hollywood, the bottom line is selling tickets they're not necessarily interested in political messaging. Ultimately, what they want to do is they want to make a profit. And if that means in this current climate shying away from certain subjects, most of them will be willing to do that.
So a movie like Emilia Perez would not be made today.
Depends on who you ask. So a lot of people would argue that Emilia Perez is only diverse and inclusive on the surface level. You know, it depicts Mexico, but most of it was filmed outside of Paris. A lot of Mexicans were upset that virtually none of the cast is Mexican. Some of them don't even speak Spanish fluently. And then, of course, you know, the lead actress, a trans woman, the first trans woman to be nominated in the Best Actress category, turned out to have an unsavory social media history in which, among other things, she referred to the Oscars as, you know, a blend between an Afro-Korean festival and a Black Lives Matter protest, because in her eyes, the Oscars have become entirely politicized and they only award films that on the narrative level have some connection to diversity and inclusion or social justice topics. So I think Emilia Perez, even though initially it was somewhat of a liberal darling, very quickly fell afoul of people who initially supported it.
Although we have to say the star of Emilia Perez made these comments while still a man. So I was wondering whether there might have been issues she had been dealing with at the time that inspired her, as you called it so beautifully, unsavory social media history. But you've outlined the fall from grace of Emilia Perez very accurately. I was wondering, to what extent have we ever discussed the political or non-political nature of movies ever before so intently? And while a lot of things remind me at the moment of the time during George W. Bush's presidency, I can't recall that we discussed Hollywood so controversially. I mean, this was also the high noon of Michael Moore documentaries, mockumentaries, which were very political. Can you recall any instance where Hollywood was eyed so suspiciously?
I mean, I think from the very inception of Hollywood, there was always this question of, should Hollywood become politically involved? And what is the responsibility of film? Is it to entertain or is it to educate? So from the 1930s on, the industry kind of self-censored via the Motion Picture Production Code. So all the major film studios agreed on certain regulations for all the films that they produced and what it could show and what it could not show. So for example, interracial relationships could not be depicted. Negative depictions of the police, absolute no-go. Then also things like, you know, childbirth, some of the more graphic parts of human life were also entirely prohibited. And this never came from the government. This was a self-censorship that all major studios agreed to, and most cinemas wouldn't screen films unless they had been approved by the Motion Picture Production Administration. And of course, in the late 1940s, 1950s, we have the Red Scare. And I see people refer to the current moment as potentially going there again, and I don't think that will quite happen. But of course, Hollywood production has always been seen as a potentially radicalizing force and something that the government wants to at least keep under tabs a little bit.
Remind us again a bit about how things turned sour for Hollywood during the McCarthy era, the Red Scare era. Maybe recall, bring back to our memories what the Hollywood 10, for instance, endured.
Yeah, so I'll give you a little Swiss connection. So Dalton Trumbo, one of the Hollywood 10, he was the descendant of Swiss migrants to Colorado. And in the 1940s, he had at some point been part of the Communist Party, but most of all, he was a very beloved screenwriter, one of the highest paid screenwriters in Hollywood. And like many of his peers, in the late 1940s, he came under investigation of the House Un-American Activities Committee,
which was made Richard Nixon big.
Exactly. So that was a committee within the House of Representatives, basically to weed out any disloyal forces in U.S. society. So in the case of Hollywood, there was a suspicion that somehow the Communist Party had swayed screenwriters or directors to incorporate communist propaganda into motion pictures. So the Hollywood 10, they had to testify in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee, and Trumbo and some of the others refused to answer questions. And he was sent to prison for almost a year and subsequently blacklisted from working in Hollywood. So he continued to write, and he actually wins 2 Academy Awards, but under a pseudonym, because he is not allowed to work under his own name. So it really interrupted careers, and it also ended careers for a lot of people. But in the case of Trumbo, it was actually also the political arena that ended his banishment from Hollywood, because in 1960 he writes Spartacus, which was directed by Stanley Kubrick, and Kubrick publicly said, "I've hired this guy to write Spartacus." So when Spartacus premieres, a lot of US veterans picket movie theaters in protest of Trumbo being hired again. But President John F. Kennedy actually sneaks out of the White House, crosses the picket line, and attends a screening of Spartacus, which was then widely reported by the Washington Post and the New York Times, etc. So media then said, effectively, President Kennedy has ended this practice of blacklisting. We can now welcome dissenting voices again as well, because that's the hallmark of democracy in the end, that you can say whatever you want as long as it doesn't amount to hate speech.
And what a great movie for this to mark the end. I mean, Spartacus is also against this rising up against power and questioning the order as it is.
Exactly.
It's a wonderful story. So you said that you don't expect things to move again in this direction, but could we see Hollywood again agreeing to a code of self-censorship, or is that something that's unlikely to happen?
Probably not on the same level as with the motion picture production code, but certainly Trump is already trying to influence Hollywood a little bit. I don't know if you saw, but he appointed some special envoys to Hollywood. He selected Sylvester Stallone and Mel Gibson and John Voight to represent an ally between the White House and Hollywood, so that Hollywood can also be, I think he said, bigger, better, and stronger than ever before, and enter a golden age again, much like the rest of the United States, and basically transform the political tenor of Hollywood, which Trump and a lot of conservatives, of course, have seen as a liberal bastion and a progressive bastion, out of touch with the rest of the United States. And Trump certainly wants to invest in sort of turning that page and including more conservative voices.
But at the same time, we have to say some of the biggest success movies are completely unpolitical. They are just the kind of popcorn party that, well, we all like to switch our brains off to and just enjoy. What I've been wondering is, to what extent do we also see a conservative movie sphere rise? I'm thinking, for instance, about that movie that has hardly had any traction outside of the United States, Sound of Freedom from 2023, that discusses human trafficking between the southern border and the United States. And that was only possible thanks to crowdfunding and became a huge success, generating, I think, $110 million at the box office. But that was really not favored by critics. Or things like Daily Wire productions, such as the mockumentary Am I Racist with Matt Walsh, that no critics discussed, hardly any critics discussed, but became relatively successful for this kind of this type of production. So are these just niche phenomena, or do we see more of these kind of conservative productions gaining traction?
I think to an extent there's always been a segment of Hollywood that has represented some of these more traditional values, conservative values. Clint Eastwood, for example, of course, in the last decade plus has very much produced films that do this. Kevin Costner, perhaps more on television than on film, but productions like
Yes.
Yellowstone, etc., and all the spin-offs of Yellowstone, these really, I think, have shown to production companies that there is an audience for these kinds of stories and these kinds of narratives as well. And of course, you have people who are progressive saying this is a completely inaccurate depiction of US history that erases the plight of indigenous peoples entirely, etc., etc. But that certainly hasn't stopped film and television from focusing on these stories. And I certainly think that Hollywood will continue to pivot toward these stories more and more because, as you say, even independent films that have gone this trajectory have unexpectedly found quite a large audience.
So at the end of the day, Hollywood just goes where the money is.
I think that's a pretty accurate way to put it, yes. I mean, it's been around since the start of Hollywood. So Sam Goldwyn, who was really one of the founders of Hollywood, who was integral in the founding of Paramount, and of course, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, it still holds his name right, MGM. He already said, if you want to send a message, use Western Union. So Western Union was the telegram company, and he very firmly believed that Hollywood should not get involved in any kind of political messaging. And I think that has been the mantra for a lot of Hollywood for quite a long time. Ultimately, Hollywood is risk averse. They want to make a sound financial investment when they decide which films they want to fund. And I think in this day and age, being risk averse probably does mean being not overtly political, because no matter which vantage point you depict, if you have a strong vantage point, you'll alienate about half of the US population.
And being risk averse means that we will be graced with a lot more sequels, prequels, and anything in between, plus remakes, etc.
Exactly.
I mean, for you as someone who is also a film scholar, has Hollywood gone stale, or are there still productions out there that you get excited about?
There are still productions that I get excited about, but I have to admit I also use film a lot for entertainment. I really don't try to approach movies from my academic perspective because I think academics probably do have a tendency to read subtext into a lot of films that we watch and, think like, wow, this film says something about gender in US society, but that might not even have been the intention or the overt, narrative of the film itself. But I do think there are also independent production companies, and in particular A24, that is still producing very, very engaging and very novel content. Because, as you say, for me, the main issue with Hollywood is just the sheer number of recycling that happens. The sequels, prequels, reboots, even things like live action movies of beloved cartoon films, such as, all the Lion King ones that are being turned to live action. I don't really see the need for that necessarily.
Yes, and I of Mufasa, I think it was called. I only saw the trailer and I felt like, ugh, no, I'll pass that one.
Yes.
Although, I mean, some reinterpretations of beloved movies are huge successes, and deservedly so. So I'm thinking of Little Women by Greta Gerwig. Yeah. I thoroughly enjoyed that.
Yes.
So I think when Hollywood finds a new take, a fresh way of interpreting material, it's wonderful. But as you said, sometimes it's just recycling for recycling's sake. Now, you said that there are productions that you're excited about and that there are movies that you enjoy. Now, looking at the topic we discussed for our listeners, what are things you recommend them to watch? I think we can't leave this podcast without having film recommendations. And what is maybe something to read or listen to better understand how Hollywood has been politicized against its wishes?
A film I would really recommend, it's a film that came out last year called Civil War by that production company called A24. And it follows a US civil war from the perspective of journalists, but it really tries to take a I can't say politically neutral perspective, but it tries to not overtly invoke the current moment. So basically the situation in the film is there's a third-term president who's become somewhat of a dictator in the United States, and other states have banded together to revolt against this, but the revolt is led by Texas and California, which in reality, of course, are states that have very little in common and would never ally together in any sort of way. And it basically tracks the...
When it comes to the economic well-being of their citizens, they might.
Okay, maybe on an economy level, yes, I'll give you that. I'll give you that.
Never lose hope.
But yeah, so the film basically tracks the decline of democracy in the United States, but depending on your political perspective, I think everyone will take away something different from it. But also the overarching message is, how can we stop this from happening, that the country becomes so divided that it really results in full-blown chaos and warfare. I think it does it in a very nuanced way. Yes, exactly. So one book I would really recommend, it's not so much about Hollywood's role in domestic politics, but it's more Hollywood's role in an international alliance building for the United States. And it's Ross Melnick's book, Hollywood Embassies. It's very long. It's about 400 pages, but he really did an incredible amount of research how all throughout the 20th century and sometimes even leading up to the current moment, the U.S. government has invested in cinematic infrastructure overseas to promote a certain image of the U.S. And of course, many listeners might be familiar with how the U.S. did that in the Cold War period, how it tried to export motion pictures that painted the U.S. in a favorable light compared to the Soviet Union. But Melnick shows that it was much more widespread and much more nuanced than that. And I was really fascinated by it because he has chapters on every single continent and just the amount of money and the number of cinemas that the US government basically owned overseas at any given point in time. It's absolutely fascinating.
And we might have been sitting in one at some point and becoming part of propaganda without knowing it.
Exactly. I mean, certainly in Beirut, the U.S. embassy there still funded an American film festival every year. Again, also selecting certain films that certainly portrayed the U.S., if not from, necessarily a utopian perspective, certainly mostly in a very positive light. So I think to an extent we can still see it reflected in some of these cultural ambassadorship programs that are still in place everywhere.
American embassies. So 400 plus page read. That sounds a bit strenuous, but something that is still doable. We should find it doable. But if we need a break, where do we get it?
I mean, there are absolutely amazing things on Netflix currently, and this is actually a British show that I want to recommend, but I think its thematic also extends to the US. It's called Adolescence. I don't know if you've read about it or seen it yet, but it's, I don't want to give away too much, but it's basically about a 12-year-old boy who is influenced by internet culture and commits a horrific act. And the show depicts him and his family grappling with the aftermath of it. So it kind of deals with internet culture and misogyny, etc. I know it doesn't really sound very entertaining, but it's very well made. And it's really, I was very impressed by it.
And it has received a lot of attention in the US media as well, because the kind of drama that it depicts has been too often an American reality. So not exactly escapism, but we always have the Minions for that, if anyone really needs a break.
The Minions or 90 Day Fiancé. I have to admit, 90 Day Fiancé is my guilty pleasure, and I take great joy from watching that.
Mine too. So to anyone not clued in, 90 Day Fiancé is one of many reality TV shows on a channel that was formerly known as the Learning Channel, TLC, and it depicts couples, international couples, where one of the pair is American, who invites their significant other over on a so-called K-1 visa, which gives them 90 days to get married. Otherwise, the other person has to go back to their home country. So which couple are you rooting for in this season?
I'm currently watching an older season, but I love the season with Kobe and Emily. I don't know if you've seen any of their appearances. He's from Cameroon and she lives in Kansas, but they have a very loving and healthy relationship, unlike many of the couples depicted.
I've actually seen them later return to Cameroon for a visit and discuss different gender roles, America versus Cameroon, and they're really cute. But this season is a bit more on the train wreck side of things. So, but this is indeed, I find 90 Day Fiancé tells us a lot about how Americans see the rest of the world and how naive many of them are. There's a pattern, I don't know whether you'd agree on that oftentimes the international partner in these couples is more level-headed and more realistic about the world and its challenges than the American partner.
Certainly. I think 90 Day Fiancé The Other Way, which is the spin-off where the Americans are the ones traveling overseas to meet their partner, that illustrates perfectly what you say. They're usually unprepared and entirely unfamiliar of other cultural customs and also unwilling to learn other cultural customs.
And we have to say, this goes about people who go to Jordan, Turkey, countries where you really should inform yourself about the different expectations, or South Korea, we've also seen. So I think, Susanna, you and I, we should get a recap show on 90 Day Fiancé, or maybe talk about international relationships at some point in this podcast. Thank you so much for joining me and talking a bit about Hollywood controversies and sharing some of your film tips and historical insight. Looking forward to have you back again.
Thank you very much for having me. This was really fun. It's always a treat when I get to talk about films and 90 Day Fiancé. So thank you.
And to everyone else, auf Wiedersehen, and have a look at YouTube. You'll find 90 Day Fiancé for sure. Take care. Bye.
Grüezi Amerika, Views from the Sister Republic, a University of St. Gallen podcast by Claudia Brüwiler.